Welcome everyone to the first of the several ASA mini conference panels that will be taking place this Friday on Fridays in May. This panel is Music as Muse, Analytics Across Performance. This mini conference, sponsored by the American Studies Association, contains panels originally scheduled for the 2023 annual meeting in Montreal. Panelists chose to reschedule their session for this mini conference in order to accommodate the Gaza walkout that took place on November 4th, 2023. The American Studies Association has published a statement offering support and solidarity to scholars, faculty, students, and staff around the world who are facing elimination, termination, suspension, and sanctions due to their advocacy for Palestinian freedom, their location in Gazan universities, their criticism of Zionism, their solidarity with resistance to occupation, and their condemnation of genocide, militarism, and war. No group of scholars faces the perils of the present moment more than students, scholars, and academic staff in Gaza. Every one of Gaza's higher education institutions has been destroyed, and hundreds of Palestinian educators and thousands of students in Gaza have been murdered in a process that the Palestinian Feminist Collective has called scholasticide. Palestinian scholars and Israeli institutions have also been arrested and silenced, including internationally renowned feminist scholar Dr. Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian. Across Europe and North America, scholars who criticize the ongoing genocide or who criticize Zionism or who support Palestinian freedom have been doxxed, suspended, and fired. Contingent faculty, Muslim and Palestinian scholars, BIPOC and QTIPOC scholars have been the most vulnerable to these attacks. Our university administrations have remained silent about the assault on Gaza's higher education infrastructure and about attacks on and endangerment of their own faculty and students who speak out against anti-Palestinian violence. Funding and support of the most vulnerable departments and faculty are threatened. Surveilling or sanctioning against teaching the full scope of the conflict, including its history, ecologies of warfare, or other related topics, creates an atmosphere of fear around intellectual engagement with war. At the time of this writing, thousands of students at dozens of universities have been arrested. Students have been suspended and face other disciplinary action, such as expulsion and eviction, and threatened and met with police violence, some even hospitalized after being brutalized and/or pepper sprayed for erecting peaceful encampments to protest university investments in Israeli war machinery. Columbia University, a campus that requires students to read Edward Said and Frantz Fanon in their first-year curriculum, has criminalized students for peaceful, nonviolent protests to colonial occupation and genocide. The events at Columbia are part of a rising wave of over 100 student encampments and protests at the Claremont Colleges, UC and Cal State schools, CUNY, University of Minnesota, UT Austin, Washington University in St. Louis, Emory University, University of Florida, Vanderbilt University, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Yale University, Princeton, and more, including my alma mater, Dartmouth College, and Stanford University. Meanwhile, at USC, Asna Tabassum, the valedictorian of the graduating class of 2024, has been silenced due to imagined objections to her identity, her politics, and indeed her existence. The list of outrageous attacks on scholars at all kinds of higher educational institutions is too long to document here, but taken together, they represent an appalling complicity with a frontal attack on and policing of all knowledge production that doesn't serve the interests of war. The American Studies Association affirms its abolitionist principles, its commitment to intellectual criticism of war, empire, and elimination, its defense of insurgent knowledge production, and its solidarity with Palestinians. Our students have the right to learn from all perspectives. As scholars who may work at institutions located on unceded indigenous lands, or who work in buildings that were constructed by enslaved labor, or whose institutions benefit from war profiteering, we have a particular obligation to affirm the necessity of critical discourse, of academic dissent, of academic freedom, and of refusal to be complicit in genocide. The ASA statement can be found at the link that has been provided in the chat. My name is Marisol Negrón. I am a professor of American Studies and Latino Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And today the presenters will present their work in the order in which they're listed on the program. And before we begin, I do want to give a reminder that while you don't need a Circle account to be able to view the sessions, if you would like to ask questions or chat, you do need to create an account. And that link is in the chat box, and it really, ASA has made it very easy to join. It's just a very quick sign up with email. And with that, I will present our first scholar on the panel, and I will read the introduction before each person begins. Cristina Mislan is an associate professor in the Missouri School of Journalism at the University of Missouri, Columbia. Adopting an interdisciplinary approach, her scholarship has focused on the relationships between media and social justice movements and the ways activists have engendered and disrupted solidarity across Black and Brown communities. Her current books in progress include Fugitive Possibilities, Black Writers and Cuba After the Revolution, and Living and Dying on the Front Lines, Climate Blues in Southern Louisiana and Puerto Rico. Her paper is titled Climate Blues, Racial Justice, Recovery, and Communal Survival.
Thank you, Marisol. Before I begin, I'm going to read a little bit, some from my paper, but I just wanted to kind of give y'all some context. I'm not a music scholar, I'm a media studies scholar. And so one of the things that I'm doing here, just so no one's confused, is that I'm thinking about blues as a kind of theoretical framing for storytelling and for oral histories that I've started doing around climate and environmental justice. And so I'm using kind of Clyde Wood's idea of like, concept, blues epistemology. And so I'm not necessarily talking about music per se, but I'm interested in the affect of blues within oral history storytelling. So hopefully that is a little clear. And then I'll read now from my paper to give you kind of some more background on what I'm thinking, what I've been writing about. Again, this is definitely a work in progress. Even since I wrote this abstract for ASA, it's changed, and I'm thinking more about kind of implementing Catherine McKittrick's work on plantation logics. But I'm open to any feedback that anyone has. I just want people to know that I'm not necessarily talking about music, but I am talking about the kind of affect of blues through a kind of Clyde Wood's lens. So I spent much of my childhood and adolescence looking through the windows of a yellow school bus that drove along the most southern parts of the Great River Road. My family lived 29 miles west of downtown New Orleans, Louisiana, where the levee lay on the opposite side of our neighborhood and hid the Mississippi River from our view. On my way to school, I would scan the large cylindrical shaped storage tanks and the protruding steel pipes that would often release white clouds into the air. And if I was riding the bus or walking on River Road at the wrong time of day, I might inhale the stench that characterized life under pollution. The metallic pipes clanged and vibrated underneath and above me. These entangled structures merged into another extractive economy, the plantations with its stately, picturesque stillness. From River Road, plantation mansions with their sweeping verandas and columns bore an illusion of tranquility. And so just for some geographical context, River Road kind of represents this really very important part of a stretch that goes from New Orleans until like Baton Rouge and beyond, Baton Rouge being the capital of Louisiana, where like Louisiana State University is. And it also represents another important kind of space for environmental justice activists that I'm going to talk about now. So as this footprint of a memory, staring outside the window of a bus that brought me home in the fall of 2022. From my current home in Missouri, I drove southward to a place that has garnered national and international recognition as Cancer Alley, or as some activists now call it, Death Alley, where politicians and industry leaders still promote the old Bourbonism politics of the state. Here, I draw from Black Studies scholar Clyde Woods, who defines Bourbonism in the Deep South as the hierarchical divisions in Southern states that enforce disenfranchisement among Black citizens, economic dispossession in all communities, and prison slavery. Whether it is a slave, oil, chemical, or grain plantation, all carry the same stench of extraction and racial violence. In recent years, the collective actions of residents and activists who have ancestral ties to the land have taken to the streets to decry the uneven effects of climate and environmental crises on communities of color. And another space, an island some perceive as a different world from the small town I grew up in, voices too have resisted what Woods might call the Delta writ large. So in this case, this is where I'm also interested in bridging the kind of voices of Southern Louisiana with also voices in Puerto Rico, which is where my parents migrated from in the mid-1980s. So they migrated from Puerto Rico to Southern Louisiana after my father accepted a position to work for the Army Corps of Engineers in New Orleans, which, by the way, if you know anything about the Corps, they were very much kind of at the center of a lot of the kind of geographical engineering that has happened in Louisiana that has not been, that has actually worsened the conditions of the geography with issues around like, you know, climate and environmental issues especially, and apparently doing similar things in Puerto Rico now, which I'm also interested in kind of exploring more in this project. So it's the central geographic sphere from Puerto Rico to Southern Louisiana that has grounded my research in questions about the loose and dense connective tissue that binds the Deep South to the Caribbean. So this is a autoethnographic project that I started, and what it does is it asks how oral histories and life story interviews with Black and Brown residents and activists carry formulations and acts of resistance that are informed by ancestral knowledge and the memory of space and place, and are in turn stories that echo Wood's conceptualization of the blues tradition, which he says, or he defines as a vision that dismantles racial and economic monopolies, redistributes monopolized resources to marginalized communities, recognizes and bestows full human rights, and affirms Black culture and intellectual traditions. So inspired by Wood's approach, I'm employing the blues as theory to analyze the affect, geographical, and temporal elements to bearing witness and storytelling through oral history and life story interviews. Activists from the Deep South and the Caribbean are fighting against old and new regional blocks of colonialism, the plantation, and industrial multinational companies. They are up against the contemporary manifestation of what activist and researcher Imani Jacqueline Brown calls the continuum of extractivism. This continuum spans from settler colonial genocide and slavery to fossil fuel production. We can witness this continuum of extractivism miles from the shores of Louisiana's boot tip to Puerto Rico. Catherine McKittrick's post-slave conceptualizations of plantation futures is helpful as well for illuminating how plantation geographies maintain anti-Black violence and death while also engendering resistance. Plantation logics help explain how corporate and state institutions have transformed Southern Louisiana geographies and let me back up, have transformed Southern Louisiana geographies into sacrifice zones, spaces that continue the project of extraction and are rendered, quote, lands of no one, and how Puerto Rico's industrial capitalism carries as well the Caribbean history of sugar plantations. And what I think is important here too, though, as McKittrick makes a point about these kinds of geographies, that while they're rendered, quote, or life is, quote, rendered unlivable for residents, what it means to adapt is to envision a future that resists annihilation while embracing the natural cycles of life and death. So I'm going to kind of skip, just based off of time, to some of the oral histories that I've done to kind of give you a sense of the voices and thinking in terms of thinking about the affect that I've been kind of grappling with in these stories. I'm going to focus on the Louisiana part because I have more of that. And currently kind of collecting more stories in Puerto Rico. So I'll focus on the Southern Louisiana part of this project. So Elaine and I grew up in the same neighborhood, and I'm using pseudonyms, by the way. These aren't the folks who I've talked to. I won't use their real names. She lived on the first block, and I lived toward the back, an area prone to flooding during the torrential downpours that usually visit a tropical and swampy place. We rode the same bus and attended the same schools. Eventually, I moved and she stayed. The year became a sophomore in college. My mom sold our home, erasing us from the neighborhood, but my friend and her parents have not moved. One afternoon, I recorded a 2-hour conversation between us at her kitchen dining table. In her narrative, Elaine grapples with living in a sacrifice zone and the ongoing presence of racialized violence via the plantation. So here's a little bit of, this is like an excerpt that I'll read out loud from her narrative. We didn't think about the fact that our school was named after a plantation. We don't even think about it. They kind of sell you on this. Oh, the plantation didn't have slaves. So that's what they try to sell you when you tell them, why the hell would you name a high school after a plantation? I don't think the rest of America knows that all of that shit is still standing in pristine condition. Through storms and everything, our shit gets flatlined every 3 years. It didn't happen a long time ago. It's now. It is now. It's in the way that the state operates. Shit, you can literally go knock on a slave house door here. It's here, now. I just watched the motherfuckers fix the roof on the slave house. It's mostly Black and brown communities that are here. This is considered Cancer Alley. I worked with a bunch of transplants for a while. Like, they won't even come here. They won't touch it. They don't want to invest here. So if the people who are here and who've grown up in this community don't have the resources to rebuild or to revitalize or improve here, then they won't, because most people just don't have the love for the area like we do. I'm going to skip down a little bit. Maybe our ancestors are trying to tell us, get the fuck. You did what you were supposed to do. Y'all need to leave. Why are you still here? It's almost like, you remember I told you my aunt found out my grandmother's mother was like from a plantation that was close. And like, we're still here. I'm literally on the opposite side of the river. Like, we literally never left. And so I'm really kind of thinking a lot about the ways in which certain ideas get repeated in these stories, right? That there's kind of patterns. And to me, I see these stories as just like beautiful poems as well. So I've been thinking a lot about how I want to write these narratives. And I'll read from a little bit from another interview that I did with someone of like a different generation from my friend who I just read her a small part of her like narrative. Now I'm going to move to an environmental activist who who's kind of really well known at the moment. But this is something that Susan is what I've given her name. Here's her kind of a little passage from her. When I grew up over here, it was wonderful. It was like, maybe you could say, living in the American dream. We didn't have any sicknesses. We didn't have a high number of cancer, and we had clean air to breathe. You will step out the door and take a deep breath of that clean air. That's how I felt, and it was clean. It was a feeling that you would have when you were just like, you felt free. You were free of sickness, free of pollution. And I want to add just quickly that one thing that this kind of narrative reminds me of like the nostalgia of a kind of a past. And we're talking about, of course, you know, Black activists and residents. And so this is a really rich part of like the geography of Louisiana in terms of how far generations go back. So for instance, a lot of the folks who still live on that land, you know, their parents and grandparents, and they have, you know, their enslaved ancestors also were on that land. So just a little bit more context. Back to Susan. Now, fig trees, they don't want to grow. The ones that we had, they died. We don't have a fig tree. I don't know anybody to have figs that I can go say, give me a handful. When I buy the fig, it is so big. And when you open it up, the inside is dry. A lot of those trees, some of them died, some of them fell in the hurricanes. Right now, the pollution is so much that the pecan trees don't bear every year. They started to bear every other year. So this is the year they don't bear at all. My neighbor died with throat cancer. My neighbor on the other side of me, she died. I don't know what kind of cancer she had, but she went away so fast. Then she found out she had cancer. She just died like that. So we have to live in fear that we might just drop. You don't care about our lives. It's a death sentence. If we're not doing anything, we're all going to die before our time. I know we're all going to die, but why should we rush it? I don't want to die praying for death. I'm going to skip the other. I had another passage, but I'll skip that in terms of time. So just as a conclusion, drawing from Wood's concept of blues epistemology, these stories illuminate the merging of racial capitalism with industrial capitalism. Woods highlights two foundations of blues social thought. One is the constant reestablishment of collective sensibility in the face of the plantation bloc, and in the face of daily community that is often chaotic and deadly. And this is what I see these stories also doing as well. And then two, social relations in the plantation South as a pillar of African-American culture. While the blues epistemology may be specific to the Mississippi Delta, I argue it might also be a lens for understanding how stories of survival in both the Deep South and Puerto Rico speak to the explanatory power of blues as a critique of the plantation and colonial system. These stories explore how longtime residents and climate and environmental justice activists are relearning the blues, as Woods would say. And I'm also interested in kind of what bridging these stories might do in terms of thinking about communal solidarity and Black and Brown solidarity, and just thinking about, you know, settler colonialism. And I just want to also say in this moment, and it's very kind of like, and all of us thinking about genocide, right? Like, how we should expand opportunities for solidarity. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Excuse me while I deal with a little bit of, there we go. So before we continue, I just want to welcome those who have just joined us to the panel, and also to remind you that if you'd like to contribute on the chat or ask questions of the panelists, you do need to create a Circle account, and ASA has actually made it very quick and very easy to do that. And so if you click on that link, you'll go right to Join American Studies Association, sign up with an email, and it's a very, very quick process. Okay, now our next panelist is Varun Chandrasekhar, whose research, which builds on his history as a guitarist, focuses on the existential condition of the jazz musician. Heating thoughts. I'm sorry, I'm getting an echo. Is that affecting anyone else? Okay, let's see what's going on. Does someone have their mic on? Or Let's try this again. Okay, sounds good.
I think it's because I started sharing my screen.
Ah, okay. In that case, now there we go. So let's start this over. Varun Chandrasekhar's research, which builds on his history as a guitarist, focuses on the existential condition of the jazz musician. Heeding Sartre's mantra that existence precedes essence, Varun wonders how starting with the complex, racially marked urban reality of the jazz musician can guide our understanding of the music. In simpler terms, how does the fact that the jazz musician is thrown into the world influence our musical intuitions, and are these properties then theoretically quantifiable? Prior to coming to WashU, Varun finished a bachelor's in jazz performance at The Ohio State University and a master's in music theory at the University of Minnesota, where he studied with Kevin Turner and Sumanth Gopinath. In his free time, Varun can often be found watching basketball or blundering pieces in online chess. Additionally, though not verifiable, Varun believes he has the most popular tweet about music theory of all time. His paper is titled Clownin in Blue, an exploration of jazz absurdism. Thank you.
Thank you, Marisol, for that introduction. So let me get this all set up. So share system audio, share here. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right, let's get started.
Man, there was this clown. He used to have this cute little gimmick where he had a seal follow him up and down a stepladder, blowing Columbia, the gem of the ocean, on a B-flat Sears Roebuck model 1322A plastic bugle. A real cute act.
So what you just heard there were two short clips from Gene Shepard's narration over Charles Mingus's tune The Clown from the album of the same name released in 1957. And if you did not know that this came from Charles Mingus, you'd be rather surprised to learn that he was the composer. Mingus was one of the hippest jazz musicians of the post-bop era. He was writing these dense harmonies. He had a swinging mentality. His music is often very groove-based. And yet what we get here is this bizarre rendition of this circus theme with a very odd narration about a clown that really seems to confound a lot of people on first listen. And especially given the sort of serious nature of many of Charles Mingus's critiques of the jazz industry, to see this sort of comedic presentation of jazz raises questions about what Mingus is actually trying to do with this humor. And what I want to do today then is read much of The Clown in line with the theories of absurdist performance to try and better explicate what is happening in this piece and to really pull apart why Mingus is being so clearly sarcastic and sardonic in this recording. So to begin, maybe where things working, there we go. I've called this a tune, and that probably does not do justice to what it is. It's really more a sort of staged narration with musical accompaniment, with Gene Shepard, the radio host, writer of A Christmas Story, giving this narration about a clown. And it's an unsuccessful clown. Even though he has a great act that fills his soul with bright colors, he can't seem to sustain an audience. No one really seems to laugh at his set. And so even though it's bringing us happiness, he doesn't really go anywhere with his career. Until one night in Dubuque. And in Dubuque, what happens is the clown slips on stage and gets the biggest laughs of his career. And as he's sort of lying on the ground, he realizes, oh, this is my end. This is my bit. I'm just going to make as much of a fool of myself as possible. And that's going to be how I'll build an audience. And this actually is successful. He starts gaining these bigger audiences. Each crowd is growing in size. He's playing bigger venues. But two things happen. First, he's never able to capture the magic of Dubuque. And second, his colors in the soul start to fade. They become dimmer and dimmer because he realizes he's not doing what he is supposed to do. This is not his authentic act. And then this peaks one night in Pittsburgh, where the stage drop falls on the clown. And upon impact, he knows he's going to die. But as he looks out, the crowd is erupting with laughter. These are laughs bigger than Dubuque. This is the magical dragon he has been chasing. And as he's dying, he hears his manager backstage getting booked for all of the biggest venues across the country. His dreams are finally materializing, with the cold irony being that he is never going to actually see these achieved, as this is his last day on Earth. And so we get this sort of tragic backdrop where we realize the fading of the colors in his soul are equated with his actual physical death. He is dead both inside and outside. And so there's an obvious critique of minstrelsy that is present in Mingus's narrative arc. The clown represents sort of your Louis Armstrong, Lionel Hampton type figures. And that's the line of reasoning most scholars go on. For example, Crin Gabbard says, part of Mingus's habit of lecturing and hectoring his audiences reflected his desire to distinguish black entertainers like himself, not only from old minstrel men, but also from more contemporary black performers like Armstrong and Lionel Hampton, who could not completely abandon minstrel gestures. Similarly, Scott Saul says this, Mingus believed he had to fight for his share of the promised land. His alternative for clowning was a heroic refusal that alienated him from the industry, even as it was based in the simple principle of personal integrity. And so it seems clear that they are taking anti-clownery positions, but the first line of the tune is, there's this clown, he has a great act, it fills his soul with bright colors. It doesn't seem like Mingus is anti-clownery. In fact, it seems much more like he is concerned with the audience reception to his clownery. And I think these scholars are not able to see this point because they're taking jazz very seriously, even though this tune is clearly anything but serious. And this is a long-standing issue in jazz scholarship. Hiroshi Garrett argues that the idea of taking jazz serious meant treating jazz as serious music, when in reality, taking jazz seriously means taking the tune for what it is. And so what I'd like to do is take this tune for what it is. And I think then we have to really engage with the fun and odd, bizarre aspects of the tune. This is in line with Mingus's general aesthetic. So Horton Spillers, in her essay, All the Things You Could Be If Sigmund Freud Was Your Mother, itself an allusion to the Mingus contrafact of All the Things You Are, says this. It is the realm of the ludic and ludicrous that the jazz bassist Charlie Mingus was playing around in when he concocted, as if on the spot, the title of the melody from which the title of this essay is borrowed. Responding to his own question, what does it mean, that he poses to himself on the recording, he follows along the lines of his own cryptic signature. Nothing. It means nothing. And what he proceeds to perform on the cut is certainly no thing we know. But that really is the point, to extend the realm of possibility for what might be known. And so what I want to do is read this within Baraka's theories of the white critic who appreciates jazz but fails to understand it. And this is clearly what's happening with the clown's audience. He has this audience member that appreciates his act without understanding any of it, which produces a sort of realm of absurdity that Mingus is dealing with. His audience simply doesn't understand him. And so in order to renew the clown, he has to be a clown. And I'm going to expand this sort of meta level critique at a deeper level throughout this presentation. Before we continue, this is Charles Mingus's catalog. This is a pamphlet he made about how to toilet train your cat, although he admits some cats are not as smart as his cat Nighttime, presumably the cover model. And I'm just putting this in here to show that Charles Mingus definitely was a clown. He was comfortable clowning. The idea that he's anti-clownery oversteps its grounds. So, this is also building off of Nicole T. Rustin Pascal's wonderful work on Mingus. I'm kind of sidestepping a lot of this just for the nature of time. But one of the big themes in her work and a lot of Mingus scholarship is the idea that Mingus was uncomfortable with the sort of boxes that being a jazz musician put him in, this sort of expected serious performance. And so what I'm thinking of is if being a jazz musician forces Mingus into this performance of a minstrel clownery, the type of thing that Gabbard and Saul are really arguing against, then what I want to suggest is Mingus refuses to perform like a jazz musician as a way above that. And that demonstrates what is the actual potential of the clown. So while on the surface level, the piece is very clearly a critique of minstrelsy, I think at a deeper meta level, it should be understood as a form of clownery that rejects the sort of minstrel box that jazz musicians are placed into. And so what I want to do is read this in terms of what Martin Esslin terms the theater of the absurd. And he differentiates this from existential staging. So existential staging is something like Sartre's No Exit, where the play shows the absurdity of the world, but does through very logical performances. You know, if you've seen a play before, No Exit makes sense. It is a logical description of illogicness. As opposed to that, Esslin champions what he calls the theater of the absurd, which takes the absurdity of real life and just places it on stage. So examples of the theater of the absurd are things like Waiting for Godot or Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which have political critiques and ideologies baked into them, but only express that through a sort of absurdist, nonsensical form of storytelling, where you kind of get plots that don't make sense. You have character motivations that are unclear. You have stories that don't really hold together. You have misleading narrators. And I think these seem to match Mingus's performance and arranging techniques. If you listen back to that boom bum bum boom ba ba boom ba ba theme, it's corny. It sounds bad. The counterpoint Mingus uses is often intentionally distorted. The narration is grotesque in its description of the clown, whose motivations somewhat make sense, but really are so over the top and exaggerated that it doesn't seem like they're human. It seems like this is a very absurd presentation. And I think this is actually interesting because then we get a very different historicization of the clown figure that is removed from the sort of minstrel trope that Mingus seems to be hinting towards at a surface level. Sorry, my slides are a little bit outside. So I want to read this in line with Bakhtin's argument in Rabalius and His World, which is a seminal on description of the carnivalesque. So in the carnivalesque, the jester figure is sort of able to create an upside down world. And think about this. It's kind of the fool who calls the king a fool to his face and suffers no consequences. And this is part of the practical use of the carnivalesque figure. Through its sort of distortion, its grotesqueness, its absurdity, you get a sort of intoxicating game where society's farce is pulled apart. And that seems to be what Mingus is using the clown figure to do, to pull apart the farcity of the jazz industry. And I think what's really interesting about this is that Bakhtin's version of the carnivalesque is exactly the same as Baraka's argument in Blues People. So Bakhtin believes that the carnivalesque just cannot exist under capitalism. It is too serious. In the same way, Baraka suggests that the blues formed out of this critique of chattel slavery, but as the blues people, aka Black Americans, move north during the Great Migration, and blues gets inedited into racialized capitalism of the recording industry, that blues loses its fundamental critique. So neither clownery nor blues people are able to actually form any coherent critique within liberal capitalism. They have to fight against capitalistic structures. And this also happens in the clown too, where the clown has to give in to the demands of a performing audience in order to get an act, but that causes him to lose himself. This is why he needs to be an authentic clown, what Mingus is doing. I'm going to play jazz that doesn't sound like jazz, so I can't be commodified like a jazz musician. And then this works within Langston Hughes's view of the Black Parrot, which is, it comes through in his first book of poetry, the Weary Blues, where he tells a poem about a black clown who is disenfranchised by the world because they do not understand his clownery. And Langston Hughes then poetically asks the question, will I be wise again as the Black Parade figure, in which he's suggesting, will the sort of specter of Black culture reproduce so that people can understand its critique? And I think this is important because Charles Mingus recorded a version of the Weary Blues with Langston Hughes, where Mingus's band provided a backdrop so Langston Hughes could recite his poetry over it. Although they don't recite the Black Parade, it's clear that Mingus was familiar with this poem, so he understands the sort of different history of the clown than the one that is only tied to minstrelsy. And so Damushka says this of Hughes. For Hughes, Perrault provided the perfect trope for which to revolt against the attempted high seriousness of the Du Bois school of critics. This point of contact between the literary and popular, so organic to the development of the Commedia from Molière to Lafreux to Oliot and beyond, explains Hughes' adaptation of the Perrault method, revealing the complex ways he attempted to reconfigure the restricting boundaries that confine Black expression in America. And this seems well in line with my understanding of Charles Mingus. This idea that being a jazz musician was the sort of restrictive block, and that clownery itself is the way out of it, the way to get a true Black expression, because this is part of the nature of blues people that is similar to clownery. And so, I think by understanding this meta-level troping, we're better able to explain the way that jazz musicians have tapped into absurdism to engage with the complex social realities of the world. And I think this is clear in the long tradition of jazz, stretching from Cab Calloway to Thundercat. There are so many different ways that really reveal much about the world. So that's about my 15 minutes, so thank you guys. Cristina, you're muted.
It's Marisol.
I'm muted. There we go. So thank you, Varun. I want to remind those of you who've just joined us that in order to chat, participate in the chat, or ask questions of the panelists, you will need to sign up for an account. And it's actually very easy. ASA has made it very easy to sign up with that link, and so it'll take you to this page and it'll be done very, very quickly. So let's see there. Okay, fantastic. Our next presentation is Dani Hawkins. Dani Hawkins is a Philadelphia, excuse me one second, I'm having a little bit of technical. There we go. Okay. Dani Hawkins is a Philadelphia-based cellist, student, and teacher whose scholarly work revolves around the themes of decolonization, race, and participation. They've pursued ethnographic fieldwork in Brooklyn, Philadelphia, Maine, and the Wet'suwet'en Territory. They received their PhD in musicology from Cornell University and have designed and taught seminars including The Politics of Listening, Sound and Civic Life, and Music in the Making and Unmaking of Race at Memorial University of Newfoundland, Cornell University, and Swarthmore College. Dani has made music with the Boston Philharmonic, the Richardson Chamber Players, the Delaware Symphony Orchestra, and various other ensembles and contra dance bands. In 2012, they released Ride EP, a DVD of original multimedia art based on footage and field recordings taken while living out of a van. They co-founded and served as artistic director of the Ottsville Traditional Arts Center in Bucks County, Pennsylvania from 2013 to 2016, and have also taught at Maine Fiddle Camp, Fiddle Hell, Summit Trios, Princeton, Asia, and open access to music education. They enjoy hot wings, being a part of Philadelphia's blooming mutual aid networks, and polar bearing. Their paper, which has been pre-recording because Dani could not join us today, is titled Transcribing Music, Transcribing Movements. And Cristina, if you could play the video now, that would be, or Christine, excuse me, could play the video now, that would be great.
Hey y'all, Dani Hawkins here. I wish that I could join you in real time, but I'm grateful to conference organizers for permitting me to participate today in this pre-recorded form. My talk's going to be about how a loose community of folk musicians associated with the American Back to the Land movement transcribes their own music, and how their example might help scholars approach problems of metaphor when writing about decolonization and abolition.
Like so many others, my approach to metaphor is primarily informed by Tuck and Yang, who decry how scholars turn decolonization into a metaphor when they conflate it with other, often epistemological models of social change, like proposals for improving syllabi or research methods. They root their argument in the thought of Frantz Fanon, who famously characterizes decolonization as violent, transformative confrontation with colonial power on a given land base. Fanon also warns about the danger of intellectuals betraying decolonization by taking mediating roles in the existing structures of a colonial society not yet wholly upended by armed decolonial insurrection. Decolonization's minimum demand, he writes, is that the last in the colonial social order become the first. That sets a high bar for writers. How do you write about something that must transform the material world to exist at all, and that, until then, is always in danger of betrayal by intellectuals? To be clear, my argument today is not that any single understanding of decolonization is the only legitimate one. As a white settler, that's really not my case to make. What instead concerns me is that, of the variety of understandings of decolonization, this one that emphasizes transformative material confrontation with colonial power is so conspicuously absent from music studies. I first encountered this problem in 2016, following my return from Unistoten, a pipeline resistance camp on unceded Wet'suwet'en territory that integrated traditional subsistence practices with material resistance. Land defenders gathered food, medicines, and other supplies from the territory, while also manning a bridge checkpoint to confront surveyors, police, and other unwanted visitors, and maintained a radio network to spot helicopters and dispatch supporters to intercept them wherever they landed. When I returned from Unistoten and began my PhD, I was asked to write something for the decolonizing ethnomusicology issue of the SEM Student News. When it was released, I noted that it addressed decolonization in very different terms than I had just encountered. Despite a host of contributions from both graduate students and established scholars, nowhere was discussion of direct confrontation with colonial power on a specific land base to be found. This gap between the work of scholars and the exigencies of on-the-ground struggle shows up throughout writing about decolonization, notably including even the writing of those who seek to intervene in this very problem, often anchoring their arguments in the work of Fanon and Tuck and Yang to do so. Here are some recent examples that indicate that the problem of not turning decolonization into a metaphor isn't necessarily solved through richer engagement with decolonial scholarship. It's more fundamental. Again, how do you keep from turning something into a metaphor through writing it down if, to exist, it has to transform the material world first? The basic terms of this question make me think of transcription. Decolonization is a comparatively new concept to music studies, but through transcription, over a century of music scholars have pondered how to write down something else that intrinsically only happens as an event in the material world: musical performance. This thinking has included scrutiny on transcription's functions as what Ter Ellingson calls a tool of colonial acquisitiveness that extracts only the transcribable practices of colonized others and effectively cannibalizes them, translating them into the supposedly objective knowledge structures of the colonial metropole, even as colonization, quote, eliminates their life worlds, end quote, in Jeff Titan's words. More recently, scholars are recuperating transcription specifically for its subjectiveness. Flora Schuling proposes an ethnomusicology of notation, in which different notation cultures can be understood through their subjective relationships to writing. I want to suggest that music studies itself can be considered a notation culture, one whose approach to transcribing music is, not unpredictably, currently much more sophisticated than its approach to transcribing decolonization. And so it follows that music scholars might have much to learn about writing decolonization by how they already think about how people write music. Purportedly decolonial writing's tendency to metaphor eerily resembles early ethnomusicological transcription in that it creates an account of decolonization extracted from its life world of material struggle. What then often comes to distinguish decolonization from other models of social justice like DEI initiatives is not transformative material challenge, but an urgently challenging affect. We must diversify now. We really mean it, and it's gonna feel really uncomfortable. In these ways, like musical transcription, decolonial writing can be colonizing. I don't think this is fundamentally due to the coloniality of the academy as it's currently constructed, although there's lots to say about that. Even if the academy were different, writing intrinsically can't be a space of direct struggle, except metaphorically. And so, the basic question reduces to this. Is transcription metaphor? Here I consult Maine Fiddle Camp, or MFC. Ostensibly an all-ages summer arts program, MFC is also a sort of annual reunion for a community that began when hippies arrived from different parts of the country in the early 70s to drop out of modernity by building log cabins, living off their gardens, and playing music together. This community is now in its 6th decade, providing a compelling example of how, in Thomas Torino's terms, a participatory musical tradition can attend a countercultural cohort as, over time, it becomes a cultural formation of its own. Now, I need to acknowledge that an overwhelmingly white community founded around the reenactment of archetypal fantasies of American settlement is hardly an obvious choice to consult for decolonial or abolitionist strategy. I look to them for 3 reasons. First, they do exhibit their own brand of radicalism. Second, they inhere this radicalism in their music. And third, they make transcriptions of that music, and here's the key part, I don't think the transcriptions erase the radicalism. Many of MFC's original homesteaders took their inspiration from the Back to the Land Bible, Living the Good Life. They would have read in its first pages this framing of the movement's central question. Where can outcasts from a dying social order live frugally and decently, and at the same time have sufficient leisure and energy to assist in the speedy liquidation of the disintegrating society? As recently as 2019, I heard MFC's camp director introduce the community's basic project as developing an alternative to modernity. It is in this anti-modernism, and especially this association of modernity with apocalypse, that I locate unlikely but compelling resonances with decolonization and abolition, especially by way of Black and Native studies. And here I'm thinking of people like Fred Moten on the catastrophe of modernity, Walter Mignolo on coloniality as the dark underside of modernity, and Kyle White on colonization as ongoing apocalypse. Significantly, many of these thinkers also seek to facilitate certain apocalypses. Glenn Coulthard asserts that, quote, for indigenous nations to live, capitalism must die, end quote. Jared Sexton considers what worlds would have to be destroyed to enable a world in which Black lives really did matter to everyone, and Frank Welderson's explicit objective is ending the world. Equally importantly, there's a deep relation between apocalypse and worlding running through these bodies of thought. It's encapsulated in notions like abolition as a presence, from Ruth Wilson Gilmore and others, and Glenn Coulthard's characterization of the indigenous blockade as simultaneous negation and affirmation of different worlds. Crucially, this is not purely theoretical brilliance, it's praxis. I've already described how Una Stoughton served as simultaneous affirmation of indigenous lifeways and negation of their colonial replacement. Similarly, during the George Floyd uprisings, Philadelphians engaged in running street battles with police and simultaneously maintained a protest encampment serving the unhoused. integrating affirmation and negation in a militancy of social reproductive labor. At the Philadelphia encampment, my main roles were eviction defense when needed and laundry duty weekly. Places like MFC are rarely considered in relation to such spaces, partly due to what Fumio Kiji identifies as a reticence to consider praxis generated in Black and Indigenous contexts as relevant to predominantly white ones. But looking beyond modernity and tangibly producing that beyond traces a long, unlikely thread between all of them. That MFC does so by reenacting white settlement on stolen land indicates the profound political limitations of their project. But these have been familiar to scholars at least since historian Jackson Lears dissected how white anti-modern movements have paradoxically consolidated modernity since the mid-19th century. However limited or contradictory, I want to insist that MFC does perform an embryonic anti-modern social order, because, most crucially for my purposes today, we can then think about how they write it down. Volunteers at MFC create lead sheets to reflect how tunes are played in the community. Like all transcriptions, they leave a lot out, as indicated by this comparison of an MFC transcription with my own account of 3 unplanned duets with community members. Despite their crudeness, or more accurately because of it, I don't think that the MFC transcription here is a metaphor. In its erasure of everything that makes this music work, responsive harmonies, bowing patterns, variations, it anticipates and functionalizes the limitations of transcription to facilitate participation, the key element of MFC's musical anti-modernism. Its real work is thus not really descriptive or prescriptive, I would argue. It's diplomatic and tactical. It's an easy point of entry for text-centric musicians and a mediation of the colonial attributes of writing. It's an affirmation and a negation. If transcriptions are potentially cannibalistic colonial translations, these are thoroughly defanged because their glaring omissions can only be filled in by community knowledge. To learn what's missing, you have to listen to what the person beside you in the jam is playing while you play too. And doing so renders the transcriptions no longer necessary. They're thus innately self-regulating. Like the top secret missives in spy movies, these messages will self-destruct. Scholars might learn from these examples when transcribing the more radical anti-modernisms of decolonization and abolition by not asking our writing to decolonize or abolish anything, but instead make sure it indicates exactly how and where what cannot be transcribed can be performed, whether that's by picking up a bow at MFC or elsewhere, a brick.
Thank you. That's it. Love to hear from you if you want to follow up on any of this work. You can find my contact info in the conference data, and I hope you have a great rest of the mini conference. Bye.
Our final presenter is Brian Edward Jones, who is an assistant professor of music industry at Francis Marion University. Jones received his PhD in American Studies from the College of William and Mary. His research interests include jazz studies, American popular music, and critical studies in improvisation. As a freelance drummer percussionist, Jones has worked with Lonnie Holley, Gary Thomas, Mark Turner, John Abercrombie, Melissa Aldana, Jean Deck, René Marie, and many others. Their paper is titled Where Pathways Meet, Sun Ra's Lanquidity and the Deleuzian Refrain.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. It's been wonderful to hear about all these fascinating projects. So here we go. On June 25th, 2021, Strut Records reissued the 1978 recording Lanquidity by the otherworldly jazz artist Sun Ra. Ra, a visionary band leader, keyboardist, and composer, created a unique cosmic musical dramaturgy that radically reimagined the normative practices of the jazz tradition. Synthesizing collective improvisation, swing band staples, Afro-futuristic poetry, and modern dance with a penchant for the carnivalesque. His Sun Ra performance was a vortex of sonic excess, inverting the standard jazz methodology with the pioneering realm of teleological subversion. Lanquidity, originally released on the record label Philly Jazz, is marked by proto-funk backbeats, the spirited interplay of twin electric guitars, and the undulating psychedelia of 1970s era keyboards. Lanquidity is anomalous within the massive Sun Ra canon, arguably representing his one and only foray into jazz rock fusion. Still, Lanquidity is singular in its rawness. Arcing synthesizer tones, swirling percussion, snake-like bass grooves, untethered horn solos, booming timpani, and celestial chanting clash and melt into a sonic intermingling of the ancient with the future. This essay analyzes Sun Ra's Lanquidity through the lens of Deleuzian theory, while simultaneously contextualizing the music on Lanquidity within the political atmosphere that haunted Ra's home base of Philadelphia in the late 1960s and beyond. A tinderbox of systemic racism, radical activism, and a toxic economic reality. During the 60s and 70s, the so-called city of brotherly love was abhorrent to Sun Ra, a milieu symbolizing the compounded failures of the U.S. political system, utilizing 1,000 plateaus, in particular Deleuzian guitarist's unique concept of the refrain. I show how Ra's improvisational juggernaut, the Myth Science Orchestra's performances on Lanquidity, sonically embodied the multi-hued Deleuzo-Guattari idea of the refrain. Or that, quote, the refrain is a prism, a crystal of space-time. It acts upon that which surrounds it, sound or light, extracting from its various vibrations or decompositions, projections, or transformations. The refrain stimulates creativity, conjures alchemy, engenders group cooperation, sparks the imagination. It is the engine of innovation. Through critical analysis of Lanquidity, this essay maps the various reifications of the refrain that Sun Ra constructed through his unique musical praxis in his work as a community leader, positing Ra's orchestra as a model of public solidarity in the world of expressive culture. In 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze begins the chapter 1837 of the refrain with a story of how the refrain alleviates anxiety. Quote, a child in the dark, gripped with fear, comforts himself by singing under his breath. He walks and halts to his song. Lost, he takes shelter or orients himself with his little song as best he can. The song is like a rough sketch of calming and stabilizing, calm and stable, center in the heart of chaos. Like Deleuze's story of the frightened child quietly humming as a comforting technique, the orchestra was Sun Ra's refrain, the manifestation of his musical life, his sounding board, his alter ego, his song. Though the orchestra was constantly in a state of flux as members came and went and the cities the group inhabited changed, the orchestra continued to represent Sun Ra's home base, his family. Bandmates might move on, but the orchestra remained intact. As music critic John Corbett states, the refrain is, quote, the return home, the shield against chaos. And for Sun Ra, the orchestra was ground zero, the starting point for all his creative operations. Recorded on July 17, 1978, Lanquidity features Sun Ra's Philadelphia-based version of the orchestra, an ensemble comprised of 17 musicians, littered with exotic instrumentation ranging from Fender Rhodes electric piano and Mini Moog synthesizer, conga drums, and timpani, a full woodwind section featuring 2 musicians doubling on oboe, as well as high brass, dual electric guitarists, and a vocal quartet. Throughout the recording, there's a constant shifting of musical roles as the juxtapositioning of sonic order and chaos, rupture and continuity become improvisational building blocks. Oboes coalesce into slippery melodies, laser-thin synthesizer lines dart peripatetically over the harmonic backdrop, and a hazy veneer of flutes and trumpets obscure the aural pathways, startling the listener with an unfixed constellation of tones. The effect is disorienting. Yet there is a constant, a refrain that focuses and unifies the action, providing an axis for the experimental proceedings. The fixed pulse groove machine that gnaws at the core of the fractured temporal plane on Lanquidity, providing the recording with a singular voice within the Sun Ra canon. I'm talking about the centering drum set grooves that give Lanquidity its unique character. The groove is the heartbeat, the human refrain. In 1968, Sun Ra and his orchestra moved into the largely African-American neighborhood of North Philadelphia called Germantown. Their headquarters was in the heart of an area with a recent history of racial upheaval and conflict. During the mid-60s, North Philadelphia was characterized by poverty, inferior living conditions, and the highest rates of crime and unemployment in the city. The average child only attended schools for 8 years. In his description of Philadelphia during the post-war period of urban redevelopment, city planning and policy scholar Robert A. Beauregard states, quote, "The city was a hostile environment. Employers were moving out, and residential segregation, an historical fact in Philadelphia, channeled the minorities into areas that soon became slums. Poverty subsequently took root in minority neighborhoods as well as white working class areas where manufacturing was disappearing." Beauregard continues this line of urban analysis, asserting that, quote, "low-income neighborhoods, minority and white, continued to decline as the industries that were once interspersed among the housing closed. Unemployment and poverty increased. In the inner ring neighborhoods of North, South, and West Philadelphia, disinvestment overwhelmed any reinvestment. The city was crumbling as its industrial infrastructure collapsed and the institutional fabric of the urban center became frayed. The conditions were combustible and tensions were high." Ra had a famously adversarial relationship with Philadelphia, calling it, quote, "the city of brotherly shove, the worst place in America, and the headquarters of the devil in disguise." Yet in some ways, Philadelphia was a good fit for Sun Ra. Describing the history of outsiders residing there, Sun Ra biographer John F. Swed states, "Philadelphia was certainly a city with more than its share of cults, unorthodox religions, prophets, and dissidents. The site of the founding of the Rosicrucians in the United States, the final earthly home of Father Divine and Prophet Cherry, and over the next 2 decades it would yield up corporate hippie New Age guru turned murderer Ira Einhorn and religio-political cults like Move, and a variety of other bizarre figures. Because there were only 2 legitimate jazz clubs in Philadelphia, the orchestra was forced to travel for work, and the expense of carrying a big band averaging 17 members was taking its toll financially. Yet at the same time, as the 60s came to a close and the 70s dawned, Sun Ra was getting more attention from the counterculture and the semi-mainstream, appearing on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine, starring in 1974's Space is the Place, a feature film about the Sun Ra Orchestra, and ultimately appearing on Saturday Night Live on May 21st, 1978. The push and pull of the musical expansion and contraction that plays against the unvarying rhythm tracks on Lanquidity's a tune on the record called Where Pathways Meet is an extension of my concept of the ecstatic rhythmic continuum. Product of the African diaspora, the ecstatic rhythmic continuum can be thought of as a thread that connects the genealogy of the rhythmic antipathy of Black expressive culture. Black expressive culture, heard within the inner workings of ragtime syncopated piano lines, the counter-rhythmic interplay between the horns and traditional jazz, the development of the feeling of swing during the big band era, the rhythmic complexity and constant shifting of impulses during bebop, the controlled chaos and violent fluidity of free jazz, and the syncretic amalgamation of static rock grooves with the free-flowing irregular patterns of post-bop during the fusion era. Where Pathways Meets begins with a soulful New Orleans-esque riff motored by the smoke-cured rumble of the baritone saxophone. Sun Ra's acoustic piano dances on top while Ali Luckman's drum set pattern swings hard, tapping into the pulse genealogy of the ecstatic rhythmic continuum. Above the groove's electrostatic linear strata, Sun Ra and company explore rhythmic possibility, instrumental combinations, and abstract phraseology. Chaos dances with order, and the musical digital code becomes liquid. At the center remains the groove, thundering like a heartbeat, the heartbeat representing the ultimate pattern of existence. And let's try to take a quick listen. Let's see. Okay. So in conclusion, space, both immanent and transcendent, always played a large role in Sun Ra's cosmic mythology. His birth in the segregated racist confines of Birmingham, Alabama, his migration to Chicago, moving with the orchestra to New York City, relocating to Philadelphia, the function of Saturn and intergalactic imagery in his political philosophy. All these locations were refrains for Sun Ra, like his beloved orchestra and the heartbeat-like groove on Lanquidity. Space represented departure points for experimental explorations. To quote Deleuze, childhood scenes, children's games. The starting point is a childlike refrain, but the child has wings already. He becomes celestial. The becoming child of the musician is coupled with the becoming aerial of the child in a non-decomposable block. The memory of an angel, or rather the becoming of a cosmos. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And so we have about 20 minutes for questions and discussions. I want to remind you that if you would like to participate in the chat or ask questions of the participants, you do need to have a Circle account. And if you follow this link that's on the screen and in the chat room, it'll take you to a really easy, quick sign up for Circle. Okay. For those folks who I see that are already in the Circle platform, if there are any questions, could you please share them? Raise your hand using the bar at the bottom of Circle or through the chat function. And one of the things that we can do while those come in or folks are getting on the platform is I could start with a question for the panelists, which is for all of the panelists, is that one of the things that cuts across all of your presentations is this question of music and excess, whether through improvisation and experimentation, for example, in the music itself, or in Cristina's case, the excess of blues as an epistemology. And so I'd love to hear from you all. In what ways do you see this concept of excess, of something that is too much, right? That does not conform within established narratives or histories, right, that exceed and transform them? How do you see this idea of excess being central in terms of the work that you're doing, the music and communities whose histories you are documenting, and histories that the music and the epistemology that you pursue, actually how it transforms it as well?
Is my microphone still on? I can't. Okay. Yeah. Well, just with Sun Ra's case, the one thing I would say, there was this idea of excess is interesting because it applies to almost all aspects of performance within, Ra's sort of his musical canon, if you will. But it also, we're talking about, a musician and a performer and a human being that, was talking about these sort of Afrofuturistic ideas, like how, when he's growing up in Birmingham, he's wondering, he's like, there's no way I can be from this place. I am not from Birmingham, Alabama, right? So I have to be from somewhere else. And so this mythology, is created with this idea that he's, from Saturn, and whatnot. But, we can also extrapolate this idea within, if you went to go see the Ellington Orchestra at the same time that Sun Ra's band was operating, very different, performance methodology. Sun Ra's there's costumes, all aspects of performance are being put into play. They're not going to just go up on the stand, be introduced, and be on the bandstand. They're going to parade in, right? They're also playing very different types of venues. And so all of this, sort of combines to create a very much sort of alternative reality to the sort of normative jazz practice of the time. And so if there's one way the excess would tie in, it's just like, wow, what a unique and radical vision of what jazz and what being a musician could be, Anyway. Thanks.
Yeah, and to build off this, with regards to Charles Mingus, this isn't the focus of my talk today, but it's another chapter in the dissertation, is the rejection of the notion of coolness in jazz performance. So Charles Mingus, for those who don't know, was often referred to as the quote-unquote angry man of jazz. And a lot of times this is reduced down to Mingus's temper or his psychological instability. And instead, I want to say, well, no, what is anger performatively doing for Charles Mingus? And suggesting the idea that anger is a way for him to get out of this sort of forced performance of coolness. And when we think of cool as sort of this restrained composure, then excess becomes a way of undoing. And I think that's a really important thing to realize in a lot of these jazz performances, is to go so over the top, so blatant in some one direction, produces the sort of modernist alienation of nothing makes sense in a very clear way that is really central to understanding a lot of the aesthetics of like Afro-modern music.
Yeah, and I guess it's a great question. I guess in my case, I think a lot about kind of the affect of resistance. And so I think that's what I'm really interested in terms of like the storytelling, like how these stories are heard and felt, and how they are like operating in terms of resistance themselves. I mean, a lot of like discourse and kind of environmental and climate justice, or actually, I don't know if we would consider it justice, but like lots of like state corporate kind of neoliberal discourse has focused on, right, notions of adaptation and mitigation when it comes to thinking about, how do we, for instance, adapt to, like, how do people adapt in Southern Louisiana when the land that they've lived on, and that their ancestors have lived on for hundreds of years is literally kind of being, is disappearing and is being kind of destroyed by, capitalists and institutions, right? And so I think there's something about these stories that people are telling as kind of to scream back to those structures. And so for me, I'm thinking a lot about like, what does that resistance sound like? Not only is it within like, in terms of like kind of embodied, but there's a kind of way in which there's a kind of affect and sound to the resistance. So like when you think about what certain people say, there's so much knowledge that resist Western kind of ideas about what the land is and isn't, right? There's so much memory and history that I think is important, and people experience the land that they're on in very different ways, especially in kind of these geographies, right? And how they kind of, I think McKittrick says it well when she talks about kind of this idea of like, when someone tells a story, they're telling the story about the land. And so I'm thinking kind of about that, like what does it mean to grapple with subtle colonialism, with like environmental degradation, and with literally kind of like with death and decay. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it's a good question that I feel like I have to kind of think more about.
And Cristina, to follow up with that, you said that you're starting to do the interviews in Puerto Rico, that you're doing them now. And I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about what are the intersections and disjunctures maybe that you're already seeing in these histories of Southern Louisiana and Puerto Rico is the first part of the question. And the second part is, how does the theoretical framework and methodologies that you're using, how do they transform our histories of Black communities in Southern Louisiana and in Puerto Rico?
Yeah, those are great questions. Lots that I'm still thinking through, right? And so
That's okay.
Yeah, for the first question, I've been thinking a lot about this. For me, so I mean, there's, in terms of the kind of stories I've been hearing so far in Puerto Rico, I think there's obviously there's kind of histories of colonialism that are different, but at the same time, we think about like the kind of history of colonialism in Louisiana, right? There's overlaps, right? The kind of, there's, of course there's French colonialism, but there's also Spanish colonialism. And so I think for me, Puerto Rico and like a place like New Orleans are so like intertwined. And so in Puerto Rico, a lot of the stories that I hear about like, resistance to U.S. empire and the experiences embodiment of like what it means to be a citizen or not, were very much similar, to stories that we heard after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans of like, Black people being kind of rendered second-class citizens, right? And so like a lot of the kind of like discourse around settler colonialism, gentrification, right? Like people's experiences in Puerto Rico. And this is also kind of connected to your work as well, Marisol, but that like kind of the idea of disaster capitalism has come up a lot in terms of thinking about what are people's experiences and stories in Puerto Rico, and struggles are very much overlap with those in Southern Louisiana, because we're kind of having to confront, right, like these kinds of like behemoth systems that see our lands as like lands of no one, essentially, right? Because we're kind of seen as disposable. And so that's, I want to argue, as I've been kind of writing and reading more, I want to argue that there's a kind of like, decolonial embodiment to this that has resonance in both geographies that brings them together. And then what was the second part of the question?
There we go. Yeah. So how does the research that you're doing and your approach to it, right, comparing these two geographical spaces that are not usually put together, right? Although the history of Puerto Rico and Louisiana, even if we think about yams, for example, right, is one of the ways in which these histories intersect. What is your work revealing? What is the potential of what your work might be revealing or transforming for us?
Yeah. I mean, because my work, I've always been interested in kind of what possibilities exist around Black and Brown solidarity. And I've been thinking about like the importance for me of bridging these stories, of taking thinking about like how do they kind of expand our imaginations of what the future looks like or doesn't look like or can't look like, right? So like in Louisiana, when, a lot of the stories that I heard where people, like one of the activists, a lot of her story was like her vision for the future of like communal gardens, of bringing back vibrancy to the land. And, in Puerto Rico, people were telling me things like, I don't want this island to be an island, what was it, Puerto Rico without Puerto Ricans, right? Mm-hmm. And so I thought, to me, like there's so much possibilities for kind of bringing these stories together to say like what can communal solidarity look like, even when, as you said, we don't necessarily see these spaces as intertwined, but for me they're intertwined, and they're separated, of course, geographically by like bodies of water, right? But like in terms of like a kind of visions and imaginations, right? I'm also thinking about like Robin D.G. Kelly's ideas of like, the kind of Black radical imagination. I think there's so much possibility for connecting these stories to essentially kind of give a sense of like what futures exist for us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Varun, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Mingus, in terms of one of the things that I was thinking about during your presentation is that minstrelsy itself is always already absurd, right? In that it relies on misunderstandings and representations of Blackness. And so in that regard, I'm wondering, I was thinking a lot about, well, what is Mingus's recording doing in relation to that, in the sense that you talked about the carnivalesque, but the carnivalesque was also, right, a strategy to maintain order. And so in what ways, I was wondering in what ways you thought Mingus as the performer, or specifically the clown recording that you shared with us, what is it challenging and consolidating these racial orders, do you think? Or is there a way that he comes out of the limits of the carnivalesque? Like what is the potential of the clown, is, I guess, what I'm asking, right? How is he undermining these dominant narratives and racial hierarchies that he is circulating within, that his music circulates within?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. I think the first thing is that I would say throughout the dissertation, I don't want to necessarily champion Mingus as getting above these structures so much as I want to demonstrate the various ways in which Mingus responds to these absurd structures themselves, which have their long traditions in minstrelsy. And so in that sense, what I don't want to do is I don't want to consider minstrelsy as just absurd, but I want to think of minstrelsy as sort of the serious belief of the white imagination of what Blackness is, as opposed to a sort of just absurdist view. Because if we don't ever get off the deconstruction train, then everything is absurd. And so by that, I mean, minstrelsy coalesces a belief in what Blackness is, and lots of forms of media do too. And so that is really the image that Mingus is working against, and his attempts to work against it. And so in that sense, like, Mingus, like Haitian Fight Song was part of like a Kia marketing campaign in the 90s. It is commodified just like anything else. Mingus, for as much as he's throwing like a Newport Rebel festival, is still immersed in the sort of grips of the capitalist structure of the recording industry. He is never quite free of them. But what I think is useful is, so Sartre writes a book about Jean Genet called Saint-Genet, where he talks about how even though Genet as a gay orphan is never able to rise above and become a fully authentic subject, his sort of symbolic mythological martyrdom demonstrates the best potential we have. And so I think that is a more pragmatic reading of the ways Mingus attempts to work over, even if he never fully overcomes.
Thank you. And my next question, Brian, is for you. And could you tell us a little bit more about Lanquidity in relation to Sun Ra's earlier recordings, and what was the reception of the recording at the back then, and even now, if you know about the more recent reissue?
Yeah, well, like I said, the thing that's really different about it is, first of all, the use of electric guitar wasn't really something that Sun Ra had really gotten into, had used at all in his bands. They were pretty much a traditional standard big band with a rhythm section with piano, bass, and drums, upright bass and drums, 4 saxophones, and always augmented drum set with percussion, but electric guitar wasn't something they used. I should just say it like that. And so, Sun Ra kind of comes out of like the Fletcher Henderson big band tradition, Duke Ellington's an idol, but then he quickly starts to expand his palette and his vision of what the band could be. And so, Sun Ra is often, lumped into what we might call free jazz, or the avant-garde jazz. And so this period of time, we got to think in the terms of when does Lanquidity originally come out? 1978. Where is he living at this time? He's in Philadelphia. And if we think to what's going on in Philadelphia at this time, we have what is called now like the Philadelphia Sound. Philadelphia International Records, that was like the Huff and Gamble record label. I'm talking about bands like Teddy Pendergrass, OJ's, Lou Rawls recorded, so this sort of like, soul music sound coming out of Philadelphia was all the rage. And, as any musician knows, you're, a product of the environment are surrounded by. And so these guys are living in Philadelphia at that time. And that was like, what was on the radio, what was being played in the clubs. And so these musicians, I'm sure, were aware of this Philadelphia sound, as we call it now. So one part of this paper that I'd really like to expand upon is try to do some research and find out, if there were any real connections to like, why. I haven't been able to find out exactly why Sun Ra embraced backbeats, essentially rock or funk beats, in such a strong way that he did for this particular recording. So I'm just sort of theorizing about this influence from the Philadelphia sound of Philadelphia International Records. But I think there's something to that. In terms of what, the Strut Records release, because it's sort of an anomaly and it has this this funk element to it. I think what has happened, Strut Records is London-based label. They kind of specialize in Afrocentric or what jazz sort of adjacent LPs, really spurred on by what we might think of as DJ culture. And so I think what has happened is, especially in the UK, DJs have sort of embraced this particular Sun Ra record as a way to find just some cool breakbeats and whatnot, to expand their own repertoire palette. And so it became kind of like in vogue throughout the late 90s until into the 2020s. And finally it was released as a reissue. I think in the reissue, there's a booklet that sort of tells a little bit about the history of the actual recording. There's, I believe, there's at least 2 different sort of a remastered version, and I think the original version and a remix version. So
thank you.
That's where we're at.
Great. And Robert Zecker entered a question on the chat, and I'll read it out. It's for each of the panelists. Robert says, all papers call to mind for me the protest slogan, another world is possible. Sun Ra creates another planetary realm, but the other papers seem to speak to that. Can you all speak about political and artistic counter-world making?
Yeah, I would say, thank you for the question, first off, and excited to see what my panelists have to. One of the big things about Charles Mingus, and Mario Dunkel talks about this in his book on Mingus, is the way that the Jazz Workshop really was designed to like give each musician their unique voice, kind of breaking free from the sort of bop 32 bar form, strict chord changes. You can get a little outside the changes, but like you always come back to that form. And instead, like Mingus's sort of more open groove modal based compositions are really this idea of how interaction can look beyond sort of the formal structures of jazz. And I wouldn't be surprised if Brian feels the same way about the way the orchestra worked. Although, like, I mean, obviously both of those come with Ra and Mingus acting as like quasi-dictatorial figures who were, you know, quite clear that this is my vision, but it's supposed to create a room for everyone to grow in. And so I think like the way Mingus's idealization is often very, although it's very extreme in its positions, he is relatively pragmatic in the way he wants it to look and work out in the real world. So I don't know if I would really say it's so much of like sort of within line with Sun Ra's like Afrofuturist aesthetic. It seems a little more pragmatic in line with Bop, but I think like in itself that is an idea of another world that is not so like hyper regulated through the structures of modernity.
Yeah, well, I can comment on that, and thanks for the question. You know, it's funny. There's actually the name of one of the tunes on Lanquidity is called "There Are Other Worlds They Have Not Told You Of." So your question's sort of right in line. One thing I would bring up was just sort of like the political economy of like sort of the jazz business that I think Mingus and both Sun Ra had a unique vision for. I mean, though just out of survival as, you know, professional musicians, both had to deal with, you know, the record company structure, whether it was with Impulse or even something, an indie label like ESP Disc. But both, you know, started their own record companies. Sun Ra created what I think El Saturn Records, EL Saturn Records. And I believe Mingus, and maybe he was in partnership with Max Roach, was Debut Records, I believe. It was a record company they started. And just this way of like trying to really take control of the financial aspect and, you know, in a way to, you know, keep their bands going as a way of agency and a way of, you know, self-determination in a business that was, you know, often abusing the musicians within this label structure. Seems to me to be a pretty, you know, radical political act at a time when very few musicians were really trying to take on something like that.
Cristina, did you want to add to that, or are you all set?
I mean, I know we're out of time, so I don't want to take any more time. I'll just quickly.
No, we can take a minute. We can take a minute.
Okay.
We can take a minute, if even two.
Yeah. I guess if I had to kind of at least give some response to this, I mean, I think a lot about kind of storytelling, right, as a kind of counter world making, right? Like, and so I think, you know, in these stories kind of, I think these stories ask us to reframe what it means to know history, to know a land, to know Earth and the world and community, and really ask us to kind of think through some of these larger questions that we're facing in terms of like climate change and environmental injustice in a kind of more, I would argue, aligns more with an indigenous way of thinking about what it means to be in the world and what it means to know about the world, right? And so I think, you know, these all kind of alternative visions that people have, you know, they're creating these visions while also clearly, you know, dying slow deaths, right? And in some cases, not so slow. And so I've been thinking a lot about kind of, you know, what does it mean to stay when so many people know that staying is like giving up so much, but to leave gives up even more. So.
Great. Thank you very much. I want to thank all of the participants for being with us here today. And I want to thank as well everyone who has tuned in. And just a quick reminder that there is a panel this afternoon as well, Mapping the Fight, IHRA Resolutions and Anti-Palestinian Attacks on the University at 1 o'clock today, Eastern Time. And of course, there are also panels that will be taking place throughout the rest of the month on Fridays. Thank you once again to everyone to the panelists for your presentations and for rescheduling for today. And thank you to everyone who was able to tune in. Hope you have a great weekend.